to CEMC, and I believe we are also streaming this online at some point. So welcome for those who are watching from Boston. Hi, Dad. And all right. So I'm Pastor Vernon. I am the assistant pastor here, and I oversee the high school ministries. And if you're new or don't normally worship with us, I encourage you to arrive here actually just a little bit earlier. We're trying this new thing. Before each service, we have donuts outside, and it's also a time where you can meet other people who attend our worship service. And something that's also new this week is we're trying this thing where the board and Pastor John and I, we each brought a book that we would recommend. So if you stand there awkwardly, you don't have anyone to talk to, or you don't want to talk to anyone, you could peruse the books. If you want to borrow one of them, I guess ask whoever's at the table. The leadership here owns the books, so if it's one of mine, just be nice to it. If it's one of the other books, yeah, feel free to throw it. This past Friday, if you noticed, I don't know if the video can see it, but it was Chinese New Year. And many East Asian cultures join in celebration during this time. They spend time with family, they check out the firecrackers and lion dances, and they get to eat lots and lots and lots of food. That's my favorite part. But actually, I found this out this past week that the day of Chinese New Year, it's just one small part of a much larger celebration, a much larger, actually, string of festivals. It begins about a month before with what's called the Lao Ba Festival. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that festival sort of builds up to the new year. And it's sort of like the Chinese version of Advent, if you want to think of it that way. So that festival is meant to look forward to this New Year celebration, which is the big thing. And then after the New Year, so we're on, I believe, the third day of the New Year. So actually, today, if you believe in the superstitions, it's the day when you're supposed to stay at home and not have guests because the dead are walking the streets. But we don't believe in that. But basically, for 15 days after the New Year, festivities continue. Each day is something new, something different is remembered on those days. And it all culminates on the final 15th day. That's the Lantern Festival. And that's sort of the Chinese version of Valentine's Day. So that'll happen in, I believe, the first few days of March. So what happens over the course of these 5.5 weeks of the New Year celebration is that the days prior to the New Year, they serve to build up anticipation and excitement for the New Year. And the big climax is the big New Year's Eve reunion dinner. That's the big dinner. That's the biggest meal of the Chinese calendar. It's the most important event of the year. And then following that is 15 days of looking into the new year. But those celebrations aren't as climactic or big as that one big reunion dinner. And, why am I bringing this up? Why am I, talking about all this detail about Chinese New Year? Well, we're in the third week of our sermon series. We're doing the book of 1 John. And as it turns out, we're at the point in the book of 1 John that is analogous to Chinese New Year. The Apostle John, when he wrote the book of 1 John, he wrote it as a letter. Probably it was addressed to the churches around Ephesus in Asia Minor, probably the same churches that he mentions in Revelation. But it doesn't actually read like a typical letter that you would find in the first century Middle East. It's missing some of the more fundamental or more formal characteristics of what you would find in a letter, like John doesn't write who it's to, who it's from. He doesn't have formal words of greetings or formal words of thanksgiving that you would typically find in other letters of the New Testament. So instead, even though it's a letter, it reads more like a written sermon. It's a sermon from a pastor to a congregation or a set of congregations. And like the sermon, the letter has many points. It has main points, it has minor points, and it has all this other stuff that supports or builds up to those main points. So what we're getting to in our passage for today is the first primary point of the letter. It's the first primary point that John makes. And like the Chinese New Year celebrations, the entirety of what we've been studying, chapter 1, the first half of chapter 2, it's all been building up to this one point in the letter. All of that was sort of the advent to this climactic point. So the climax is our passage for today, where all of the previous stuff culminates into what will be the first of 10 commands that John gives to his readers. And really, the 9 commands that follow, they're all predicated upon this first command. So this is the one command that is foundational to the letter. This is key. So just to give a short recap, in the first 1.5 chapters, John has been setting us up by introducing this duality between light and dark, which are antithetical, they're exclusive of one another. And in these two spheres, the light and the dark, John places different persons, different characteristics, different qualities. So on the side of the light, we have God, who is light himself. We also have on the side of light genuine Christians, true Christians who have proven themselves by how they obey God and how they love others. We learned that in the previous 2 sermons. And there's also Jesus in the light, who is the one who perfectly obeyed God and perfectly loved others. On the other side is the darkness, and on the side of the darkness we saw were those who claimed to be in the light, but they didn't prove it by their actions, by their attitudes. And they're the people who fail to obey God. They're the people who neglect the needs of others, who cause others to sin. And they're the people who don't follow Jesus, who is the only one who can get them out of the darkness and cure their blindness. And all of this sets us up for John's first command, which is, we'll find today, it's in the form of a prohibition. John is saying, don't do this, don't do something. And this prohibition is what opens up our passage for this morning. So if you have your Bibles with you, I invite you to turn to our passage in 1 John. We'll be in chapter 2, verses 15 to 17. And if you don't have a Bible handy, the passage is also printed right there inside the program. I won't do the thing that I did last week where I read something that's not there. So it's there if you need it. And as we read and study this text for today, I'd like for us to consider and focus on 3 questions that will hopefully help us understand the flow of what John is writing here. So the 3 questions are as follows. Number 1, what is John prohibiting here? What is John prohibiting here? In other words, what is the command that he gives? What is John prohibiting here? Number 2, why is John prohibiting it? Why does John give this command? Why is John prohibiting it? And number 3, what then should we do instead? What then should we do instead? If John is prohibiting something, then what is the positive side of that? What do we do? So with that, we'll read from our text, 1 John 2, verses 15 to 17 out of the English Standard Version. This is God's word. He writes, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life, is not from the Father, but is from the world. and the world is passing away along with its desires. But whoever does the will of God abides forever. Let's pray. Our Father, as we continue our study in 1 John, Lord, I pray that you would speak to us today. Help us to understand what is it that you don't want us to do, and what is it that you actually want us to do. Help us to figure out more of what it means to be in the world, and help to keep us from the darkness, Lord. So, Lord, we ask that your Spirit would speak to us this morning, that it would mold our hearts and conform us to the likeness of your Son. I pray all this in your Son's name. So our first question to consider is, what is John prohibiting here? And the answer to that is pretty clear. It's right there in verse 15. It says, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." So what is John prohibiting here? The answer is, John is prohibiting love for the world. John is prohibiting love for the world. John tells his readers not to love the world or the things in the world, because anyone who does love the world, according to John, doesn't have the love of the Father in him. In other words, they can't love the Father if they're loving the Word. That's what he means by that. Now, that seems pretty straightforward. Don't love the world. So, we can move on to the second question, right? Well, before we do that, before we move on, let me pose this question. If you were here with us last week, didn't John just, didn't he just write about loving other people? And isn't that part of loving the world? So, doesn't other people count as, what's in the world? So how can we not love the world and yet still love other people? That seems contradictory. So the key to understanding what John means by this command, do not love the world, is by understanding what he means by the word love. And we'll be seeing throughout this sermon that we'll be defining a lot of different things, because that's key to understanding this passage. So what does he mean by the word love? The word there in the Greek is the verbal form of agape. Agape. And this is the word that he's been using throughout the letter so far. So every time you see the word love, John is using the word agape. And if you've been around Christian circles for long enough, agape is one of those words that Christians love to use, pun intended. It's this word that you hear very often in churches and in preaching. And the way that Christians typically would define agape love is unconditional love. Unconditional love. It's this love that no matter what someone does, you still love them. No matter what faults they have, you still love them. And you love them to the extent of sacrificing whatever it takes to win them back. And of course, the greatest example of this unconditional love, this sacrificial agape love, is Jesus Christ when he died on the cross. But to define agape love in that sense, as unconditional sacrificial love for God or for another person, that's actually only part of the definition. That's a superficial definition of agape. It's only tapping into the end result of, or the expression of agape. The origin of agape is not quite known. No one really knows where it comes from. It really only started becoming more commonly used in Scripture. But it's suggested that the root of the word agape has more to do with attraction or satisfaction. It's the object of your attraction, or the object of what you would find most satisfying, that determines how you would use that word agape, or love. So if the object of your attraction is the welfare of other people, or the glorification of God, if that's what attracts you, then your agape love for others or your agape love for God would be expressed as unconditional love or sacrificial love. But if the object of your attraction is pleasure or gratification, what you can get out of an object, then your agape love for what John would call the world or the things in the world would be expressed as indulgence or striving for something for the sake of enjoyment. That's still technically agape love, just with a different object. So to put it simply, when John says do not love the world, he means don't put your satisfaction in what the world has to offer. Don't let the world and the things of the world be the object of your attraction. Don't be attracted to that stuff. So hopefully this begins to clarify some of the meaning behind John's command, and hopefully that makes the answer to our first question a bit clearer. So our first question was, what is John prohibiting here? And we found that the answer to that was John is prohibiting love for the world. John is prohibiting love for the world. He's telling Christians not to place their attraction and ultimate satisfaction in what the world is offering. And this brings us to our second question. Why is John prohibiting this? Why is John prohibiting it? What's the reason for why Christians shouldn't love the world? John gives two reasons for why we shouldn't love the world. And to see these two reasons, let's read again all three verses of our text. John writes, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever." The first thing to note is that John puts the world in opposition to God. John puts the world in opposition to God. The world and everything that's associated with the world is apart from and is opposite to and antithetical to God and everything that's associated with God. In other words, the world is on the side of the darkness that John's been talking about. And it has nothing to do with the light. The world is equated with what John considers evil. The world is equated to what's evil. And the way that we get this, if you notice in verse 15, is that love of the world is literally set in parallel to love of the Father. So love of the world is parallel to love of the Father. He writes, "Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." So John is putting these in parallel to contrast them, to say that they are opposites of one another. And that's the first reason for why we shouldn't love the world. Why is John prohibiting love of the world? The first answer to that is because the world is opposite to God. The world is opposite to God. Now, one of the natural questions that arises from this is, what exactly does John mean by the world? What does he mean by the world? Does the world include, the natural created world? Is John saying it's wrong to love nature? The mountains, the sea, animals? Are those all evil? Does the world include human culture or human institutions? What about people who aren't believers? Aren't they part of the world? What does John mean by the world? Well, one clue is found in the middle of verse 16. Verse 16 says, "For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world." So John here, he's listing three vices: desires of the flesh, desires of the eyes, and the pride of life. In ancient literature, when you listed three things, the number 3 was associated with evil. So a lot of ancient writers did this. Whenever they listed 3 things in a row, they were saying that is what it means to be evil. That is the summation of evil. And that's what John's doing here. He doesn't consider these 3 vices to be examples of evil. He's saying that these 3 things are the totality, the entire collective of what's evil, what's considered evil in the world, what's opposite to God. And this is further supported by the fact that when John says, for all that is in the world, the word all is singular, not plural. And we know that because John uses the verb, the singular form of the word, verb to be, is. All that is in the world. So that word all is a collective. That pronoun it's representing the entire collective of what's evil in the world, what's in the world. So what are these 3 vices? Usually I don't like to dissect different things that are listed out in the Bible, but for the purpose of this sermon, I think it'll help us. So desires of the flesh. Flesh, when Paul uses the word flesh, it's almost always used as something that's evil in and of itself. But when John uses the word flesh, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's evil. Flesh, when John uses it, refers to the physical body, physical needs, like food, drink, intimacy. Those are desires of the flesh. Those are things that the physical body needs. It's everything that makes us physically human. To be human means to need food, to need water, to need intimacy. And those things aren't in and of themselves evil. And John himself writes in the Gospel of John that Jesus, the Word, became flesh. So he certainly didn't become evil, but he took on a physical form that had physical needs. So John doesn't see flesh as evil. It's just the physical part of what it means to be human. We hunger, we thirst, and we long for intimate relationship. So when John says desires refers to the source of our human impulse, the source of our human behavior. What drives us to do the things that we do and the way that we live. And so this becomes desires of the flesh becomes something that's considered evil when we become so driven by these physical needs that are natural physical needs, that we end up doing it in a way that's unnatural. So, and that usually leads to some form of addiction. So the unnatural drive to fulfill the natural need for food is gluttony. The unnatural drive to fulfill the need for drink is alcoholism. The unnatural drive to fulfill the natural need for intimacy is sexual immorality. So desires of the flesh means the impulses driven by our natural needs but sought out in unnatural ways. That's desires of the flesh. What about desires of the eyes? The eyes here, when John uses eyes, he refers to basically what can we see physically? What is in this physical world? And so this becomes something that's considered evil when we're driven only by what we see on the surface, rather than the true value of that object underneath. It's being short-sighted when you focus only on what's physical. It's a tendency, one scholar put it this way, it's to be so captivated by how things appear on the outside, on the surface, that we lose sight of what's underneath, the true value. You know, does this even matter eternally? Is this object, is this physical thing of eternal significance and value? And when we focus our sights just on the material possession, the material world, we're focusing on what is not eternal. And that's what John means here. Desires of the eyes means the impulses driven by appearance rather than eternal worth, or intrinsic worth. That's what is meant by desires of the eyes. And finally, the pride of life. What does that mean? Well, pride has to do with arrogance. It has to do with overconfidence. And pride refers to the expression of a person's overconfidence. And the word there for life refers to not, eternal life or true life, but the word there, life, refers to the resources that are needed to maintain your life or your livelihood. So what are the resources that are needed? This includes wealth, it includes time, it includes your social status, it includes all the resources that we possess. And so this becomes something that's evil when we become so secure and prideful in our own possessions and our own accomplishments that we overlook our need and our dependence on God. And actually, it was God who blessed us with all of that to begin with. And so when we have the pride of life, it's to say, thanks, but I can do it on my own. I've built up this life for myself and by myself, and I don't need God. So what does John mean by the world and the things of the world? What is the totality of what John considers evil? It's these three things. It's being overdriven by our natural needs, it's being overdriven by physical appearance, and it's being overly secure in our accomplishments. To the point that we do things in unnatural ways and we lose sight of what's eternal and what's true. Or to put it simply, the world is the way of life that's driven by impulses resulting from our sinful nature, our fallen nature. The world is the way of life that's driven by the impulses resulting from our sinfulness. It's sinful nature driving a sinful lifestyle. It's sinful nature driving a sinful lifestyle. So when John says, do not love the world, he's asking the question, where do your impulses come from? What is the source of your behavior, of your decision making? Who's making all the decisions? Or as Pastor Dennis, the guy who had my job before me, if you're watching, hi Dennis. The first time I met Pastor Dennis was actually 5 years ago on this very weekend. And on this exact day, February 18th of 2013, he preached on a passage, I forget what passage it is, but the only thing I remember from that is he asked this question: who's in the driver's seat of your life? Who's in the driver's seat of your life? Who's the one controlling where you're going? Who's making all the decisions for you? And that's exactly what John is asking here when he says, do not love the world. Is God and the things of God what informs your every decision? Everything we try to achieve, everything we do, and every word that is produced from our mouths? Or is it the world and the things of the world that's influencing all of that? So the source of your impulses can't come from both God and the world, because the two are on opposite sides. That's what John's saying here. You can't serve two masters. You'll either hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to one and you'll despise the other. So that's the first reason for John's prohibition here. We shouldn't love the world because the world is opposite to God. The second reason why John says that we shouldn't love the world is found in the first part of verse 17. It says, and the world is passing away along with its desires. John's argument here is that we shouldn't love the world because the world and everything that's in it, along with its desires, is all passing away. And that's our second reason for not loving the world. The world is passing away. If the flesh referred to our physical needs like food, drink, intimacy, and the eyes referred to the superficial outward appearances, the physical realm of the world, and life referred to the resources that we acquire to maintain our livelihood, then the thing that all of these three vices or three things have in common is they're all temporary. They won't last forever. They'll stay here on earth when we move on to the next life. If our drive in life is to be satisfied by our physical cravings through unnatural means, then our lives would be spent on things that have no lasting value. If our system of determining what's valuable in life is based only on what we see physically, then that's focusing on the temporary. The physical things of this world won't last. If we take pride in our wealth, our resources, our positions that we hold, or the accolades we've achieved, all of that doesn't matter in eternity. All of that will pass away. None of that will make it to the next life. When we die, when we enter into either heaven or hell, all of these things will be left behind. Because the world is passing away. So, why does John command us to not love the world? The first reason is because the world is opposite to God. And the second reason is because the world is passing away. If you want to sum it up in one statement, what the world offers is temporary at best and rebellion against God at the worst. What the world offers is temporary at best and an active rebellion against God at the worst. So basically, in the very best scenario, when God judges us for how we lived our lives on earth, in the very best case, he'll say, you focus on things that are temporary. You focus on things that didn't last. Why did you waste your life? Why did you waste your time? You lazy servant. But in the worst case scenario, when we're standing before God in judgment and he looks upon our lives, he'll say, why did you rebel against me? You set yourself as my enemy. And that's why we shouldn't love the world. Because it's temporary at best and rebellion at the worst. And that brings us to our final question. If God's command is to not love the world because it's antithetical to God and because it's temporary at best, well then, what should we do instead? What should we do instead? What is the positive, complementary command to this prohibition? And the answer to that is in the final part of our passage. Let's read again, verse 17. It says, and the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. If loving the world and the things of the world means it's what Christians shouldn't do, then what is it that Christians should do? Here it is. Christians are called to do the will of God. Christians are called to do the will of God. John says that the one who does the will of God is the one who will abide forever or remain forever. Basically, when all of the other stuff have passed away, when the world has passed away, God's will is what Christians need to focus on, because that is what will last. Is what will get us to remain forever. So what does it look like to do the will of God? Well, first it means we need to recognize that with each passing day, the world, its values, its attitudes, its sense of autonomy, that's all temporary. That's all passing away. It means recognizing that our jobs, our status, the stuff that we own, the stuff that we buy, the new fads that pop up, the latest version of Snapchat or whatever app, or the latest movie, or who won Best Actor or Best Actress or Best Picture, none of that really matters in light of eternity, unless it's part of God's will. Only if it's attached to God does it last into eternity. And we need to see that. We need to recognize that as we live our daily lives. Second, we need to redefine our values. We need to define our values and how we make decisions based on the things that will last. If the world is what's temporary, we need to base our lives and our values on what will last. In our high school Sunday school class, we call it YAS, or Youth at Sunday School. We've been learning the topic of heaven. And it's a long, long series. But one of the things that we've learned about heaven so far is what Jesus meant on the Sermon on the Mount when he said, when he told his disciples to lay up treasures in heaven. What does it mean to lay up treasures in heaven? That doesn't mean that every Christian will have some, treasure room in their heavenly mansion that's full of, gems and diamonds and bitcoins. That's not what it's saying. When Jesus says lay up heavenly treasures, he means to invest your time, your life on the things that last. It means that our resources, our time, our energy should be poured into things that will make it past this life. And what is it that will make it past this life? Not our wealth, not food or drink, not our academic degrees or our career advancements, our pets. I mean, it depends on your theology, but I personally don't think that even our pets will make it into eternity. I know that's wrong. You can talk about it with me afterwards. But I believe that none of these things will continue into eternity. That doesn't mean we should neglect them, or that we shouldn't pursue them, or we shouldn't, feed our pets. But these things shouldn't be what drives us in life. It shouldn't be the basis of our impulses. The only thing that will make it beyond this side of eternity is people. People. And so it's people that were called by Jesus to invest in. That's what it means to lay up treasure in heaven. It's being loving, kind, generous, faithful, sacrificial to other people. And ultimately, it's about sharing the greatest gift of grace with them, the gospel, trying to win their souls back onto the side of light. People are what's valuable in God's eyes. And that's what Christians are called to invest their lives in. John commands us to not love the world, which means don't adopt the world's attitudes and the lifestyle that it's trying to promote, because the world, it's temporary at best, but it's rebellious at worst. Instead, we're called to do the will of God, which means being driven by what has eternal value, which is people. I mentioned earlier that we have a time for donuts and fellowship before each service, which, by the way, is a great way to invest in people. And I also mentioned that we just started this thing where we feature some books that the leaders have recommended. And the book that I brought this week, that I sort of snagged before anyone could ask to borrow it, is this book, Gospel Fluency by Jeff Vanderstelt. And the reason why I chose this for this week is because it's about how the gospel should and can inform and transform our everyday normal lives, which relates to what we find here in 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 to 17. If we read this passage from 1 John, and all we glean from it is that, specific behaviors like drunkenness, sexual immorality, pride, are sinful and wrong, that's to read this text superficially. It's only to graze the surface of what John's trying to say. While all of those are indeed sinful and wrong, that we need to be aware of, they're only symptoms of a much deeper problem. And that deeper problem is that life according to the world means rejecting and rebelling against God. That's the deeper problem that we sit in. Every human value, every human code of ethic, everything that the world deems as right and wrong, those codes are all inherently flawed because they're all built on a false idea of reality. They're built on this reality that there is no God and that the standard of living isn't given by a God. It's determined by us. It's determined by people. But if it's determined by people, then it's subjective. It's based on human opinion. And that's why it's flawed. When we reject God, we reject His right to define the standard of living, the standard of what's valuable, the standard of what's right and wrong. So even if we don't profess to be atheists, even if we're Christian, whenever we reject God's direction of how we should live, what we should do, we're in a sense at that moment being atheists in practice. We're saying that, God, you don't exist, at least in this area. I'm going to dictate how I'm going to live. I'm going to let the world dictate how what I'm going to do in this situation. So one of the premises of this book, Gospel Fluency, is that at the root of every single sinful act that we do is a sinful belief. If you trace every sin that you do back to its source, there's something you believe about God that is a lie, that is wrong. And so what this book encourages us to do and helps us to practice is whenever we find ourselves sinning, trace it back to its root. What is the thing that you're believing about God that is wrong? And then work your way back up and ask for forgiveness after you readjust that belief to what is true. And that's what John is trying to say too. Don't love the world, because whenever you love the world, you're living upon a set of lies. But rather, live according to God's will. And that will set you right and help you to decide what to do in life. So, if you want to borrow this book, come see me afterwards. I'd be happy to lend it to you. But for now, we need to let God have His rightful place in our lives. He alone should be in that driver's seat. He alone should be the one to say how we ought to live, because only God can truly satisfy our physical needs. Only God can fully captivate us by showing us how much He's worth and how much we're worth in His eyes. And only God can give us true security in our lives because of what Christ did. If we believe in Jesus, we have security in knowing that we have eternal life. One scholar puts it this way, and this is what we'll close with. I love this quote. She says, "If our lives are not directed toward God in our every decision of each day, then even our most passionate efforts and causes amount to polishing brass on the Titanic." If our lives are not directed toward God in every decision of each day, then even our most passionate efforts and causes amounts to polishing brass on the Titanic. We're trying to do something on ultimately a sinking ship. So that's what I want to leave us with today. John commands us, God commands us, to not love the world, because to do so is to polish brass on the Titanic. Let's pray. Our Father, Lord, thank you for helping us to understand this passage a little bit better. And Lord, I confess that I need this passage. I need to be reminded to not love the things of this world, to not have my life be directed by what this world has to offer, because ultimately it leads to a life that is set opposite to you, that's set in rebellion against you. So Lord, search the deepest depths of my life, the crevices where I've not allowed you to be Lord over, and help me, Lord, to help you be Lord over my life. And I pray that that would be the prayer that each of us have this morning. Lord, that we would allow you the rightful place in our hearts and in our lives, to lead us through this life, to show us what your will is. And Lord, help us, give us the strength to follow that. Give us the strength to lead lives that reflect you and the character of your Son. So Lord, help us to follow you by obeying you, by loving others, as you have written through the words of your servant John. We pray all this in your Son's name.